You usually notice the cold chain when it fails. Not in a dramatic way. There is no alarm, no announcement, no single moment where someone says, "This is the problem." It shows up quietly. A carton of milk that smells wrong before the date printed on the side. Strawberries that arrive firm, red, perfect, and then collapse overnight into something damp and sour. A piece of fish that looks fine until it doesn't. A box of produce that gives off a faint heat when you open it, like it has been holding its breath too long. Sometimes the failure is smaller than that. Sometimes it is only doubt. A clinic receives a shipment. The labels are correct. The paperwork is complete. The vials are still cold to the touch. But no one can say with certainty what happened during the last few hours of transport. No one can prove that the temperature never drifted. The medicine might be fine, or it might not be. Cold, when it works, leaves no evidence behind. It does not announce itself. It does not improve the taste of food or make medicine feel stronger. It only slows things down, quietly, invisibly. And when that slowing fails, biology resumes its schedule. Bacteria do not wait. Enzymes do not pause. Decay does not care why the door was open too long, or the truck was delayed, or the power flickered just once. Most of the time, when cold disappears, nothing dramatic happens at all. Food is thrown away. Shipments are rejected. Losses are written off. Someone absorbs the cost. And then, the next day, the system moves on. That is what makes the cold chain difficult to see. It is not built around moments. It is built around continuity. The promise it makes is simple. That temperature can be held steady long enough for food and medicine to arrive intact, even as everything else moves. And that promise has quietly shaped how the world eats. Before refrigeration, cold was local. If you lived in a place with winter, you could cut ice from frozen ponds and rivers. If you lived near mountains, you could store snow. If you had money, you could build an ice house, line it with straw or sawdust, and pay people to keep it stocked. If you had none of those things, you ate what the season allowed. Food was consumed close to where it was grown. Meat was slaughtered and eaten quickly, or preserved with salt, smoke, or drying. Fruits appeared briefly, then disappeared again. Loss was not considered failure. It was part of the system. Distance and time were enemies. Heat was a given. This is the world Frederick Tudor was born into. In the early 19th century, Tudor looked at frozen ponds in New England and saw something different. He saw excess. He saw winter as inventory. And he decided to ship ice to places that had never had it. The idea sounded ridiculous. Ice melted, shipping was slow, and no one in the tropics thought of cold as something you purchased. Early shipments failed. The ice arrived smaller than it left, or not at all. The market did not materialize. Tudor lost money. He became a public joke. At one point, his financial collapse landed him in debtor's prison. But Tudor kept returning to the same problem. Slowly, he began to understand it. The challenge was not temperature. The challenge was waste. Ice could survive the journey if it was insulated properly. If it was packed with sawdust. If it was handled carefully. If it was stored in ice houses built at the destination before the ship ever arrived. And even then, the system only worked if people wanted the ice once it was there. Cold had to become familiar. There is a moment recorded in accounts of this era where ice runs out in a hot port during summer. Cold drinks disappear. Desserts melt. The absence of ice becomes noticeable, even embarrassing. Something that was never expected before is suddenly missed. That moment matters, because it marks the shift from novelty to expectation. Tudor did not invent refrigeration. He did not solve the problem of melting. What he did was teach people what it felt like when cold was no longer available. And once that feeling existed, demand followed. Ice houses became part of port infrastructure. Delivery schedules mattered. Loss became something to manage, not accept. Cold, for the first time, began to travel with intention. Not as a trick, not as a luxury, but as something that, once experienced, felt necessary. That expectation would quietly support everything that followed. In the middle of the 19th century, cold was still something you found. You found it in winter. You found it in shaded cellars. You found it where geography allowed it to exist. What you did not do, yet, was make it. John Gorey was not trying to build a system. He was trying to treat patients. He practiced medicine in Florida, where heat pressed in on everything. Fevers were common. Illness lingered. clinics filled with air that felt heavy and unmoving. Gorey believed that cooling the environment around the sick could help them recover, not as comfort, as treatment. To do that, he needed cold where none naturally existed. Gorey pursued mechanical ice making, experimenting with ways to compress gases and create artificial cooling. In 1851, he received a U.S. patent connected to a refrigeration concept and apparatus. On paper, it worked. Cold could be manufactured. In practice, almost everything resisted the idea. Natural ice was already an industry. Artificial ice threatened existing businesses. The machinery was expensive and unfamiliar, and the value was not obvious to people who had learned to live without it. Gorey was not an entrepreneur in the modern sense. He did not have distribution networks or investors waiting in the wings. He did not have a market trained to expect cold. He had a belief that temperature mattered to health and a machine that could lower it. That was not enough. His work did not scale. It did not spread quickly. He died without seeing his ideas widely adopted. But something important shifted anyway. Gorey changed the category. Cold was no longer only something you harvested from nature. It was something you could generate. That distinction mattered, even if it took decades to become useful. Because harvested cold depends on place and season. Manufactured cold depends on systems. Tudor had shown that people could want cold once they experienced it. Gorey showed that cold did not have to wait for winter. They were separate breakthroughs. One creates expectation. The other creates possibility. The cold chain depends on both. At the time, the world was not ready to combine them. The machinery was fragile. The costs were high. The infrastructure did not exist to support artificial cold at scale. But the idea was now loose in the world. Cold could be made on demand. And once that idea existed, it did not disappear. It waited. There is a difference between something that works and something that works every day. In the 19th century, refrigeration existed mostly in that first category. It could be demonstrated. It could be explained. In the right conditions, it could be made to function. But it was not yet dependable in the way industry demands. Industry does not ask whether something is possible. It asks whether it is repeatable. Beer provided the pressure that refrigeration needed. Brewing is a biological process that depends on temperature discipline. Fermentation responds to heat quickly. Too warm and flavors shift. Batches spoil. Consistency disappears. In an era when breweries were growing larger and serving wider markets, variability was expensive. Brewers needed cold, not as a novelty, but as a constraint they could trust. This is where Carl von Linde enters the story. Linde was a German engineer working in a world that was beginning to value precision. His refrigeration work helped make artificial cooling practical at industrial scale. Using systems that relied on ammonia as a refrigerant, Linde developed machines that could operate continuously, not just in demonstrations or controlled environments. The significance of that shift is easy to miss. This was not about making things colder. It was about making systems stable. Linde's work moved refrigeration out of the realm of experiment and into the realm of routine. Machines could run day after day. Temperatures could be held within narrow bands. Failures could be anticipated and managed rather than accepted as inevitable. Cold became something you planned around. Once that happened, refrigeration began to spread outward. Breweries used it to control fermentation. Slaughterhouses used it to slow spoilage. Warehouses used it to hold inventory longer. Each use case extended the time between production and consumption. Each extension made distance less threatening. But even here, the system was incomplete. Refrigeration inside a building solves only part of the problem. Food does not stay in one place. It moves from slaughterhouse to storage, from storage to transport, from transport to market. Every transfer is a moment of exposure. Every delay is an opportunity for heat to return. What Linde's era established was the core engine of the cold chain, but not the chain itself. The machine mattered, but so did the people operating it. Industrial refrigeration required attention. Pressures had to be monitored. Leaks had to be detected. Systems had to be maintained. When something went wrong, there was no buffer of time. Biological processes resumed immediately. Cold did not forgive neglect. This is the point where refrigeration stops being a clever solution and starts becoming a discipline. It demands training. It demands procedure. It demands that human behavior align with mechanical limits. And once industries experienced what reliable cold made possible, they did not want to give it up. Consistency became an expectation. Predictability became a requirement. Cold was no longer a trick that impressed visitors. It was a machine that shaped decisions. And machines that shape decisions tend to spread. Refrigeration inside a building is one thing. Refrigeration in motion is something else entirely. Once food leaves a controlled space, the clock starts again. Distance reasserts itself. Weather matters. Fuel matters. Human attention matters. For most of the 19th century, this was where cold stopped. Ice houses and chilled rooms could slow decay locally, but oceans remained barriers. Heat accumulated slowly but relentlessly during long voyages. Meat spoiled, fish softened, loss was assumed. Then, in the early 1880s, something changed. A shipment of frozen meat left New Zealand bound for Britain. The distance was enormous. The route passed through warm climates. The stakes were obvious. If the cold failed, the cargo would arrive as waste. The ship did not carry certainty. It carried risk. Refrigeration systems of the era were not self-managing. They required constant monitoring. Temperatures had to be checked, airflow adjusted, mechanical problems addressed while the ship moved and rolled and vibrated through weeks at sea. Salt air corroded parts. Fuel consumption mattered. A single failure could undo the entire voyage. There was no romance in this work. The crew was not chasing innovation. They were trying to keep a system from slipping. Every day the meat stayed frozen was a small victory. Every hour without incident was proof that cold could survive motion. When the shipment arrived intact, the implications were immediate. Distance no longer meant decay. Geography no longer dictated diet in the same way. Producers could sell to markets far beyond their immediate surroundings. Refrigerated shipping did more than move food. It altered economies, but the system was fragile. Cold did not move itself. It had to be carried. Every transfer point became a test. Loading docks, storage holds, rail connections. Each step required coordination. Each delay created heat, and heat, once introduced, could not be negotiated with. What made refrigerated shipping different from early refrigeration was not the machinery alone. It was the requirement for constant awareness. Someone had to notice when temperatures drifted. Someone had to respond before the drift became failure. Someone had to understand that time itself was an enemy. This is where the cold chain began to resemble the systems that would follow it in the modern world. Not automated, not self-correcting, but resilient through vigilance. The success of frozen shipping did not eliminate risk. It redistributed it. Loss no longer occurred only at the point of production. It could occur anywhere along the route. Accountability stretched across oceans. Responsibility became shared. Cold crossed distance, but it did not simplify it. Instead, it demanded new forms of coordination. Schedules mattered more. Documentation mattered more. Trust between buyers and sellers depended on unseen conditions maintained by people they would never meet. This was the quiet transformation. Food was no longer tied tightly to place. Markets grew abstract, and temperature became a negotiable variable rather than a fixed constraint. Once that shift occurred, there was no return. Because once a society experiences food that travels without spoiling, it begins to organize itself around that possibility. And cold, having crossed the ocean once, was no longer content to stay put. For most of its early history, refrigeration belonged to industry. It lived in breweries, slaughterhouses, warehouses, and shipholds. It was expensive. It was loud. It was handled by people who understood pressure gauges and failure modes. Cold existed where profit or survival demanded it. It had not yet entered the home. Clarence Birdseye did not set out to change that. He was not working in food manufacturing when he made his most important observation. He was working as a naturalist, spending time in Labrador in the early 20th century. The environment was harsh. The cold was immediate and unforgiving, and people who lived there had long since learned how to work with it. Birdseye watched fish freeze in the open air, not slowly, instantly. Pulled from the water and exposed to extreme cold, the fish froze so quickly that their texture was preserved. When thawed later, they did not collapse into mush the way slowly frozen food did. The difference was not the presence of cold. It was the speed. That distinction mattered. Slow freezing allows large ice crystals to form, rupturing cell walls and degrading texture. Rapid freezing creates smaller crystals, preserving structure. Birdseye understood that what people disliked about frozen food was not the idea of freezing, it was the damage caused by freezing too slowly. This was not a laboratory insight. It was an observational one. Birdseye took that understanding and began working backward. If rapid freezing preserved food, then machines could be built to replicate that process. Equipment, packaging, handling methods, all of it had to be designed around speed. He succeeded in creating a process that worked. But solving the freezing problem exposed a larger one. Frozen food is useless if it cannot stay frozen. A package of fish that leaves a factory in perfect condition becomes a liability the moment temperature control falters. So frozen food forced refrigeration to expand beyond factories and warehouses. It demanded cold storage facilities. It demanded refrigerated transport. It demanded freezer cabinets in retail stores. Eventually, it demanded refrigerators and freezers in homes. This expansion was not glamorous. It was wiring and insulation, compressors and maintenance schedules, retail layouts and delivery routes, capital investments justified by trust that consumers would buy food they could not immediately eat. Frozen food did not just change diets, it changed planning. Households could store food longer. Shopping became less frequent and more strategic. Seasonal foods became available year-round. But none of this worked unless the cold chain held together through every handoff. From factory to warehouse, from warehouse to truck, from truck to store, from store to home. Each transition added risk. Each freezer door opened and closed carried consequences. Each power outage mattered. Each assumption that the system had been handled correctly carried weight. Cold, once it entered daily life, faded back into the background. People stopped thinking about how it arrived. They noticed it only when ice cream softened or freezers failed. Birdseye is often remembered as the man who made frozen food popular. What matters more is that his work forced refrigeration to move closer to consumers, embedding cold into routines rather than industries. Cold stopped being something that happened elsewhere. It became something people lived with, and once that happened, expectations shifted again. Food was no longer something you consumed immediately or preserved yourself. It was something you trusted the system to preserve for you. That trust would soon be tested in motion. Cold inside a building can be engineered. Cold in motion has to survive reality. Roads vibrate. Engines fail. Fuel runs low. Weather changes without permission. For most of the early cold chain, this gap mattered. Warehouses could hold temperature. Ships could, with effort, maintain it. But once food left those environments and entered overland transport, reliability dropped. Distance returned as a threat. Frederick McKinley Jones approached this problem from a different angle. Jones was a self-taught engineer. He did not emerge from an academic laboratory or an established industrial pipeline. He learned by building, fixing, adapting. His work focused on making refrigeration portable, robust enough to travel with cargo rather than wait for it at fixed locations. The significance of that shift is easy to underestimate. Portable refrigeration changes the question being asked. Instead of asking where cold exists, the system begins asking where it needs to go. Jones's work helped make refrigerated trucks viable. Cold could now move across roads, not just sit in storage or cross oceans under constant supervision. Temperature control could accompany food from rural production sites to urban markets, from ports to distribution centers, from warehouses to retailers. This mattered for food, but it mattered just as much for medicine. During wartime, portable refrigeration made it possible to move blood, vaccines, and medical supplies under controlled conditions. The same system that preserved meat preserved lives. Cold became infrastructure not only for commerce, but for care. Mobility changed how the cold chain functioned. Previously, refrigeration clustered around points of concentration, factories, ports, cities. Portable systems allowed it to stretch outward. Smaller producers could access distant markets. Perishable goods could travel farther without immediate spoilage. Rural areas became part of temperature-controlled networks rather than isolated endpoints. But mobility alone does not create scale. For cold to move globally, logistics had to become predictable. This is where containerization enters quietly. Malcolm McLean did not invent refrigeration. What he changed was how cargo moved. By standardizing containers and the cranes that lifted them, he reduced handling time, loss, and uncertainty. Goods no longer had to be unpacked and repacked at every port. They moved as units. Once containers existed, refrigerated containers could exist. Cold no longer depended on bespoke arrangements. It could be standardized. A refrigerated container could move from ship to truck to rail without being opened. Temperature could be monitored continuously. Exposure could be reduced. This did not make the cold chain safer by removing risk. It made it safer by reducing variation. Predictability is what allows systems to scale. With portable refrigeration and standardized containers, cold became independent of place. It could travel inland and across borders. It could connect producers and consumers who would never meet. The cold chain was no longer a series of isolated cold rooms. It was a network. And once cold became networked, it began to shape global trade in ways that were difficult to see but impossible to undo. The modern cold chain is not fragile in the way early systems were. It does not fail because the idea is unproven or the machinery is experimental. It fails because it operates at scale, under pressure, across uneven conditions. Cold today depends on energy. Electricity powers compressors, sensors, monitoring systems, and storage facilities. Where electricity is cheap and reliable, the cold chain hums quietly. Where it is expensive, intermittent, or unavailable, cold becomes a gamble again. Diesel generators fill the gaps, bringing their own costs and vulnerabilities. Fuel must arrive on time. Maintenance must be constant. A single interruption can undo days of careful handling. This is not an abstract problem. In many regions, cold storage exists only at major hubs. Food travels, part of the journey protected and part of it exposed. The cold chain becomes a patchwork rather than a continuous line. Loss concentrates at the weakest links, often far from the consumers who never see it. A perfect warehouse cannot compensate for a hot loading dock. A refrigerated truck cannot undo hours spent waiting in the sun. Cold chains most often fail between handoffs. That weakness is structural. The system is only as strong as its least controlled moment. There is also the matter of refrigerants. Early chemical refrigerants made refrigeration safer and more accessible, accelerating the spread of cold into homes and businesses. But their environmental consequences emerged slowly. Chlorofluorocarbons damaged the ozone layer, leading to international agreements that phased them out. Their replacements avoided that damage but contributed heavily to warming, prompting further global commitments to reduce their use. The cold chain sits inside this contradiction. It protects food. It reduces waste. It stabilizes supply. And yet, the way cold is created can undermine the climate systems that agriculture depends on. This is not a simple trade-off. Improving cold chains can reduce total emissions by preventing food loss, but only if efficiency improves and leakage is controlled. The outcome depends on discipline rather than intention. Technology alone does not resolve this tension. Human behavior matters just as much. Most cold chain failures today are not dramatic mechanical collapses. They are process failures. A door left open too long. A pallet staged incorrectly. A sensor alarm ignored because it goes off too often. Paperwork that says a shipment stayed cold without proof that it did. These failures are quiet. Food is rejected. Shipments are discarded. Costs are absorbed. Trust erodes. During the global vaccine rollout of the COVID era, these dynamics became visible to the public. Ultra-cold requirements made temperature control a headline concern. Mishandled shipments made the news not because refrigeration was new, but because its failure carried immediate consequences. What became clear was not that cold chains are unreliable. It was that they are exacting. They demand care at every step. They reward steadiness and punish shortcuts. They do not tolerate assumptions. Modern cold chains operate across borders, climates, and regulatory systems. They link people who will never meet, relying on shared standards and invisible compliance. When they work, nothing happens. When they fail, loss appears suddenly and without ceremony. The tension at the heart of the modern cold chain is not whether it matters. It is how much effort society is willing to invest in maintaining something that only becomes visible when it breaks. A truck backs into a loading bay. The rubber seal presses tight against the dock. The engine idles. Inside the trailer, the air is dense and cold, held there deliberately. When the door opens, the temperature does not rush out all at once. It leaks, slowly, measurably. Someone scans a pallet. Someone checks a display. Someone moves quickly, not because they are rushed, but because they know how little time they have. This is what the cold chain looks like when it works. There is no celebration, no acknowledgement that something important just happened. Food moves from one controlled space into another. The temperature holds. The system continues. Most people will never see this moment. They will see the result instead. A grocery shelf stocked with food grown somewhere else, harvested earlier, preserved long enough to arrive intact. Medicine that works as intended. Prices that do not spike because a shipment survived the journey. Cold does not call attention to itself in these outcomes. It disappears into routine. That disappearance is the point. The cold chain is not a single invention or a single breakthrough. It is a habit repeated millions of times a day. Doors closed promptly. Sensors checked. Schedules followed. Energy supplied. Repairs made before failure becomes loss. It is an agreement between machines and people who understand that time is heat, and heat is decay. Once that agreement holds, trust becomes possible. Buyers commit to shipments they will never see handled. Sellers plan harvests knowing distance will not destroy their work. Families shop without calculating how quickly food must be eaten before it turns. This trust is easy to overlook because it feels normal, but it was learned. It began when people first noticed what it felt like when cold was suddenly gone. It grew as machines made temperature controllable and systems made it repeatable. It stretched as cold learned how to move, then how to scale. And it persists only because attention never fully leaves it. The cold chain does not protect food through cleverness. It protects food by being consistent. In a world that moves constantly, the consistency continues its quiet work, every day, without applause, until the moment it stops. Subscribe to The Invisible Backbone. We focus on the systems most people never think about until something stops working.